I'm Jeff with Clearwater Plumbers.
And I'm Brian with Clearwater Plumbers.
Okay, we're going into the 8 things every homeowner should know about their water supply. Number 2 here, we're talking about chlorine with Mr. Brian. So, Brian, I got a couple questions for you. So, we talked about city water and well water and co-op water and surface water. Where are we finding chlorine?
So, chlorine is going to be found in any city system. Any city water system, and then also in some of these municipal systems. If there's, say, a neighborhood that all comes off of a group well system, in other words, where they're paying for well water, those systems are also going to be chlorinated.
Okay. And why would they, why would you chlorinate water? Why would you put chlorine or anything like that in a water system?
Chlorine and free-floating chloramines are used to disinfect the water. Without it, the water piping systems are so long and so expansive that there's just multiple situations where bacteria can be introduced and people would get very, very sick from drinking that water.
Right. So if you don't disinfect the water, there's a chance of bacteria growing in those pipes. And if you're pushing it 10 miles to the far reaches of New Fort Worth, without the chlorine, people at the end of the line could be getting sick.
Definitely. The longer that water has to travel through the pipe, the more possibility of bacterial infection.
So is chlorine good, or is it bad, or is it both?
I would definitely say both. It's definitely good and definitely necessary during the delivery of the water, basically taking it from the water tower or wherever the city or municipality is getting it from and sending it to you. However, once it gets to you, really, I wouldn't consider it all that great at all.
Right. And the results of the chlorine disinfection process.
Sure. So once chlorine and free-floating chloramines have done their job, you end up with trihalomethanes. And a lot of sources do consider this a carcinogen. It's basically the resulting factor of the disinfection process.
Okay. Let's see here. And so chlorine, a little history on chlorine. Do you know where that came from?
So, put me on the spot here on history.
Would you tell me, Brian? So I think chlorine came from back in, I don't know if it was Hitler's days or whatever, but it was an inhalation hazard. They were using it as warfare.
Oh, like chlorine gas.
Chlorine gas,
mm-hmm.
Right. So the chlorine gas is an inhalation hazard. And I got a side story on that.
Please.
My wife's called the fire department that I know of one time in 40-something years. And what she called the fire department for was, we have a pool, and we have a bucket of chlorine that we add tabs to the pool. She went in the pool house and opened the top of the thing in the summertime. There was a little bit of moisture in there. And when she took the lid off of it, it hit her, and she breathed it in. And she breathed it in where she couldn't breathe anymore, just getting hit with a heavy wall of chlorine from this 5-gallon bucket, to the point that she called the fire department. She didn't call the fire department. She was on the phone with a friend. The friend called the fire department because nobody was at home. So I guess on that, just saying that the chlorine really is an inhalation hazard. And actually the fireman that came over there to our house said that earlier in the month he did the same thing, where he sat in front of this chlorine bucket, opened it, and got hit with this wall that took his breath away. So it's kind of interesting, though, and you can think what you want and look it up and do your own research. I definitely don't want to tell you, but I would say there's definitely negative effects of chlorine gas, but there's positive effects in the drinking water system. So how do you reduce the chlorine and trihalomethanes after they've done after the chlorine's done its job of disinfecting it, if you want it out of your system, if you don't want to drink it, is there anything you can do?
So chlorine it's a chemical. And one of the best ways to remove these chemicals from the water is with carbon. Okay, and I'm not talking about a small scale ice maker filter full of carbon like one of these guys here. I'm more so talking about a large scale carbon filter. This is going to create the volume you need for a whole house to remove chlorine throughout and for a longer period of time.
So this is tell me how that works. Is this if this was like my house, I've got what do I have at my house?
So this is a Clack brand 5 micron carbon filter, 1.5 cubic feet. So essentially in this tank is 1.5 cubic feet of 5 micron coconut shell carbon. When water enters, basically through a process known as adsorption, the carbon is just going to suck out chlorine, trihalomethanes, and free-floating chloramines. It's going to act just like a sponge sucking up water, only it's going to be pulling out chemicals. It's going to buffer the water, in other words, and remove all that.
Got it. So the water enters there, the chlorine adsorbs, or the carbon adsorbs the water.
The chlorine.
The
yes.
chlorine, thank you. Okay.
Now, one of the nice features about these is that they are going, versus this just being a carbon filter and strictly doing adsorption, like we said, it's a 5 micron filter. So it's also a sediment filter. So any little sediments or anything that are kind of getting through that water, this is going to take them down to 5 microns. Now, to give you an example of what 5 microns is, a human hair is about 80 to 100 microns. So this is a very tiny, minuscule amount. Any sludge or anything will be taken out by this.
So that's pretty amazing. So human hair is 80 to 100 microns, and then that filters it down to 5 microns, which is teensy.
It's very, very small.
Right. Okay. Do you have any more on chlorine?
No, I mean, the big thing with chlorine is, they say that the worst way to get it in your system is through inhalation. Now, normally speaking, when chlorine's in water, it's pretty stable. You get it in the house. It's not like you're breathing water. However, if you think about when you're taking a shower, steam, at that point, that chlorine that's in that water has also turned to vapor. And so that's one area where they say you can inhale chlorine.
So we tested this a little bit ago. Will you explain this? So this was from my house this morning about 7:30. I pulled a sample from down by my pool, our drinking water, City of Fort Worth water, and Brian tested it this morning.
So this wasn't pool water. This was actually from the potable water system, correct?
Exactly. Correct.
Okay, just to clarify there.
Yes.
But we are actually using a pool test kit. Mm-hmm. And so you can see here, this yellow vial, we're easily sitting at about 2 parts per million, if not higher, of chlorine. Now, and you have a pool. What do you usually test, or what do you usually try to set your chlorine at in your pool?
So in my pool, in my house, what I try to run is about 1 parts per million chlorine, which is kind of interesting because a lot of people, they go swimming, and then they want to rinse. They say, "Well, I want to rinse the chlorine off, so I'll jump in the shower." But what they don't get a lot of times is that whenever they go to rinse the chlorine off after they're swimming in the pool, if they're using city water, they might be getting more chlorine than they would in my pool. So, yeah, the city water is about 2 parts per million this morning. It depends, I think, time of the day, how many folks are using it, and then where you are in the distribution system,
exactly.
like you were saying, right?
So one thing to back on that pool subject, if you think about it, when you have a swimming pool, you're definitely trying to keep things from growing in your swimming pool when you add that chlorine. So if we're trying to keep things from growing in the pipes of a water distribution center system, how much chlorine are we going to need there? It's going to be about the same as what you're putting in a pool. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like drinking pool water. Now, as far as that, you were talking about the distribution center and where you're at. think about it this way too. Chlorine's going to dissipate the further away from the initial source that it goes. It's going to be watered down some. It's going to lose some potency. So the closer to the source you are, the higher level of chlorine you're going to have in your water.
Right.
They have to definitely add a lot more at the source in order to get that 1 to 2 parts per million down the line wherever it ends.
As it disinfects, as it goes, it drops in the level of. Okay.
As the chlorine does its job, it basically starts to expire. So it will actually drop down, not only just because of dilution, but also because of what it's doing to the bacteria.
Got it. Very cool. All right. I think that covers chlorine. We'll jump off to our next segment.
Got to do what you ought to, clear water.